see my screen?
Yes.
This is just a reminder that it is being recorded and it will appear on our website. So if you happen to miss it tonight, look for it on the GSOC website because our lectures are there.
I can't even see it.
Okay, let's see if I can. Yeah. Okay, so I'd like to tell you just for some of you newcomers and good to see some unfamiliar faces as well as all the familiar faces. But I want to tell you a little bit about the Geological Society of the Oregon Country. We've been exploring the Pacific Northwest geology since 1935. So we were started back by some students from the University of Oregon. They had a Portland venue and Dr. Hodge would come up from Eugene to lecture up here. And there were so many interested people that they started GSOC. And our association with Portland State, we were meeting here before Portland State was Portland State. So, but in 1946, after the Vanport flooding, then the college moved to downtown Portland and became Portland State University. And we've been associated with them ever since. One notable professor, John Elliott Allen, was a GSOC member, and he was a GSOC president. And it was quite good to have somebody of his stature there with the group. Since we've been meeting in Kramer Hall at Portland State University since 1971. Actually, we met in a small basement for a while, but we are now in room 53 at Kramer Hall, which is the one that's being pictured here. Holds 150 people, and sometimes we had it full. Okay, GSOC over the years has been very active and very instrumental in fostering the knowledge of geology throughout the Pacific Northwest. And one of the things we did early on in the 1949, right around 1950, was we played an instrumental role in getting OMSI started, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and also Camp Hancock. Lon Hancock was a GSOC member, and he had a dream to start Camp Hancock, which is still going today. I know many scientists that got their start as kids camping at Camp Hancock. So it was very productive throughout the years. All of our lectures are free and open to the public and free. And we normally meet, like I said, in room 53 at Kramer Hall. GSOC is involved in many activities in a normal year. So we would have our Friday evening lectures at Kramer Hall. We have field trips, which are usually, but not always, in the summer. But I mean, most of them are in the summer, but we do have some in the spring and even in the fall. Normally, we would have a holiday party, and that would be going on this month in December. We also have a March annual banquet, which is very well attended, and we have some we've had some really outstanding speakers do the banquet presentation. We normally have a summer picnic, and we maintain a library and are involved in many special projects. One of which is we hosted a table at the GSA Cordilleran event, and we expect to do one next year as well for the national meeting that's in Portland. GSOC offers our field trips. So just for a minute, I just want to say that our field trips are outstanding, led by experts, inexpensive. We have a variety of several day field trips, extended field trips to farther locations, but we're also working on some great ones here close to home that can be done in just one day or 1 or 2 days. You know, so look for that. But for to attend, all our lectures are free, but to attend a field trip, you need to be a member or a guest of a member. So, but that's not hard to do. And so you can just go to our website, gsoc.org, and register. It costs $16 for students to register for a year and $26 for individuals, $36 for a whole family. And this is a yearly thing. You don't have to be a member to attend our lectures. We are incurring some costs here, and so we would appreciate any donations that come in. We usually, at the door, we would usually ask people to donate. We can't do that anymore because we don't have a door, but you can go to our website, gsoc.org, and find a link to donate. Okay, I wanted to mention that this is our board, and we've got a fine board going this year. I know I, for one, really appreciated the support of the board during a very difficult year, trying to decide how we were going to deal with COVID. And we had to cancel our banquet very early on before it became apparent that this was a pandemic that was going to affect us for a long time, but the board was very helpful in that. We got a great board. What are we expecting for next year? The big question. Well, we've actually assembled a greater board. And so we have, this is the time that I would like to introduce our new board members to be. So Clark,
Sheila, if I can interrupt, I think your duty here is to announce nominations and ask for nominations from the floor. I'm informed.
Okay, I will do that. So these are nominations. Clark for president, Bonnie secretary. You can see them all here. Barb Stroud treasurer. Myself will do programs. Carol does field trips. Paul's communications. Carol Miles for outreach. And then we have two members at large, Dennis and Dawn. So if you are interested, those are our nominations, and we will be voting on it next month, February. No, wait till February and vote on it. But if you're interested, send me an email and we'll see what we can do. You know, we'd love to have you if you're interested in being a part of a really great group. So field trips planned. We do have, we've been pushing right along with field trips here, and with the understanding and the sincere hope that we will get to run them this year. So we are planning for them, and you can see a list of them here. Let's see, is Carol Hassenberg with us, and would she like to say anything about field trips? I didn't get a chance to talk to her ahead of time. Carol, if you're here and want to say something, speak up. You would have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, someone had to do that for me.
Okay.
Yeah, we are going to be having a pretty full field trip schedule. We are going to be going through Wild Apricot, our membership platform, to take people's, to register people for the trips. We haven't discussed some of the details of that process yet, but we'll be sending emails out to people. There may be a couple, 3 trips coming up where we will need to do some announcements on making reservations for your lodging or campsite. And so keep that in the back of your mind. I know that for a fact that one of the trips are going to need to have you look at getting a campsite if you're planning to do that. So other than that, you'll be seeing more on the trips in the spring, and hopefully COVID will be over and we can actually have these trips. We're really looking forward to doing that this summer.
Good, and we're very hopeful that it's going to work out, and if not this summer, next summer. So we are putting planning into those, and stick with us here, folks. Okay, thank you. Okay, also want to let people know that we have a meetup, and Paul, would you like to say a few words about meetup and what it is and who's involved?
Yeah, well, our monthly meetup, which used to be at Woodstock Wine and Deli, is now on Zoom. It's, I think, what is it, the third Saturday of the month? So it's going to be next Saturday at noon. And we're going to start a little earlier. We're going to start at 11 for social hour and have breakout rooms. If people want to just hang out, they can do so. And then at noon, we'll start the program presentation, which involves introductions. And Andrew Dunning, our grad student friend, who might be with us tonight, will be discussing the geology news. And then Sheila is going to lead a sort of rock and mineral discussion and show and tell. So the way it works right now is if you sign up through Meetup, you can leave a rock or fossil in the photo gallery, and that becomes your show and tell. And then we all sit and look at your rock or fossil and you know, scratch our heads and try to figure out what it is. So it's a lot of fun. It runs from, again, we'll open the doors at 11 and people can just kind of hang out and chat in our pre-show. And then at noon, we'll start the actual program. We'll hear from Andrew, from Sheila, and do the show and tell. And we invite other speakers as well who are interested. And we've had Dr. Emily Cahoon. We've got some other great speakers coming up. I can't say who just yet, but people are always welcome if they have a special presentation they want to make. So again, that's next Saturday at 11 and noon. You can sign up through Meetup. If you're afraid of social media and Meetup, I understand, but that's the best way to do it, because that way you get the Zoom link reliably and we know who's coming.
And now who is invited? Do we have a specific group of people that we are, or is this just open to anybody?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is certainly open to all of our regular members, but a Meetup is sort of one of our front doors to the outside world, now the virtual outside world. We get a lot of folks who are just sort of curious about geology, or maybe they've just come to town and they're trying to meet people. So it's a really good way. So we have a variety of people, you know, some of whom who haven't, or just thinking about geology for the first time, some of whom are sort of sticking their feet into the hobby, some people with a lot of experience. So it's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun when we could all have a sandwich and a beer, but it's almost as much fun now that we're meeting virtually. I think we've kind of cracked the code of how to do that in a way that's really fun and informative.
Great, okay, good. And that's the third weekend.
It is
The
next
third
Saturday at 11
of
and noon.
each
Yeah.
month.
So
Okay,
that's the third Friday. Yes, it is. The third Saturday.
third Saturday, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, good. And then just a few housekeeping things before I turn this over to our speaker. Just asking you folks during the presentation, please remain muted or mute yourself so we don't have too much background noise. And do ask your questions, though. If you have a question of the speaker, ask your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring the chat box for questions, and then there will be time for live questions as well. So I want you to sit back right now and enjoy the lecture. Thank you for coming to GSOC.
David Williams is an author, naturalist, and tour guide whose award-winning book, Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography, explores the engineering projects that shaped Seattle during the early part of the 20th century. In his talk tonight, David will explore stone ranging from 3.5 billion years old to 120,000 years old, the most commonly used building stone in the country, and rock used by the Romans to build the Colosseum. David, thank you for being with us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me? Great.
Yep.
Well, it is always a pleasure for me to speak to geology groups. I've done this a few times in other places, and I always enjoy the questions I get asked. And also, one thing that also is great is if I don't know the answer, probably someone else out there has the answer. I'd like to thank Paul and Denny for setting this up and for inviting me to speak to you all. The way it's going to work tonight is I will do a share screen and basically narrate my talk. I will try and keep the chat open and try and pay attention to that, but I don't know if Paul or Sheila or who's monitoring it, if there's some pertinent question that comes up and you all want to interrupt me and I missed it, please don't be shy, just break in and say, hey, David, we've got a question. I will be happy to answer them at the end, but if there's some that come up in the middle, I'm also happy to answer them. So let's see if we can make technology work, and I'm going to try my share screen and do this and go to that. And we can see you, it's good. Screen's up there, Paul.
Looks good.
All right, great. As I said, it is an honor and pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. Thank Denny for that short intro. Let me just give you, tell you a little bit more about myself before launching into this talk, looking at building stone from around the world, really, but mostly in the US. I've been based in Seattle for most of my life. I grew up here and moved back about 20 years ago. And in that time, I've been interested in writing about the intersection between people and place, trying to understand the landscape and how do we influence landscape and how does landscape influence us? And have done this through a variety of books. The talk tonight is based on this book, Stories in Stone, which has come out in 2 different editions. There's a hardback and then a paperback. And I can talk a little bit more if you're interested about buying it at the end. There'll be some information about that. So let me just launch in and go back a little bit more in time. I got a degree in geology from Colorado and ended up moving to southern Utah right after college and basically became addicted to the geology of that landscape. If you've been there, you know it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. I hiked in the rocks, biked, canoed, backpacked. I mean, it really became my life, and it's how I sort of defined myself and had my relationship to place. It's how I saw the world, was through the geology of this region, and feel very blessed to have been able to be there for as much time as I was. But then my wife decided to go to grad school and we moved to Boston. And Boston was a bit of a shock. A little bit different weather, a little bit different traffic. The statistic I always like to give is Grand County, where I lived in southern Utah, where Moab is, 2 people per square mile. Boston, where we lived, 20,000 people per square mile. And in particular, if you're a baseball fan, we lived in this apartment right next to Fenway. If you're a baseball fan, it would have been amazing. If you're not a baseball fan, you would have felt assaulted by the noise. And I really lost my connection to place, the way that I saw the world. When I moved to Boston, you could sum up my knowledge of Massachusetts geology, Plymouth Rock. That's all I knew. I didn't really know much else about it. But I did what I always do in urban environments. I started walking. I started to explore the streets. I started to look at the buildings. And I discovered this amazing geology in the buildings there, whether it was the slates on this building of Memorial Hall on the Harvard campus, or this granite in the oldest extant granite building in Boston from 1750, or the pudding stone, such a wonderful name in this church in Boston. And it started to ground me and started to give me a connection. And then one day I was walking on the Harvard campus and I came across this building. It's the oldest building on campus. And I looked at the bottom of the building, and you know what geologists like to do. You like to pound buildings. You get your rock hammer out. We get our rock hammers out and we hit buildings. Unfortunately, I figured that was a little bit frowned on, but the building had weathered quite a bit. And I distinctly remember one day going up and rubbing the building and having that sand, the grains of sand in this material, what those on the East Coast call brownstone, erode into my hand. And I had this epiphany, and I realized that brownstone was the exact same thing as the red rock of southern Utah. They just used different names. A sandstone with a little bit of iron in it that basically gave the rock its red color. And it was from that moment on, I started to try and explore and understand the stories that were told in buildings by looking at the geology, trying to understand what are the human stories, what are the geology stories, and where do they intersect? And that's what I want to do tonight, and tell you a series of stories, all from Stories in Stone. And even though this talk does not center on Portland, many of the rocks that I mentioned are found in Portland stones, Portland buildings, and I'll come back at the end and address that a little bit then. But I want to start out with the oldest rock that I want to start out and do the classic geology, go from oldest to youngest. And since I'm in Seattle, those of you who know Seattle, I'm just a little bit north of Green Lake, about 7 miles north of downtown. But where I want to go initially is I want to go to Morton, Minnesota. I want to fly across and go to a quarry about 200 miles west of Minneapolis, down to this little town of Morton, just a few thousand people. But just outside of the town is a very small quarry site. And this quarry site right here, basically it's abandoned or very little used right now, so it's flooded as most quarries are. But if you were to go down and go into the walls, where I was lucky enough to go several years ago, you would find this rock, the Morton Gneiss, known in the trade as the rainbow granite. 3.54 billion years old, the oldest commonly used building stone on Earth, at least that I've been able to find. A beautiful, beautiful rock. And it's a classic, nice form due to some continental collision. The black is the oldest part at 3.5, the pink a little bit younger, about 2.7 billion years old, but just a beautiful, beautiful rock. And one of the things I like about it is its use in architecture. It was very commonly used in Art Deco architecture from around the country. This happens to be the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, but it's also used in more mundane buildings. The Morton Liquor Store, probably the oldest rock-covered liquor store in the world. And if you walk the streets of Morton, you will find the oldest sidewalks on Earth, 3.5 billion year old sidewalk stone. It's that common, that regularly used in the area. But where you also see it is in Art Deco buildings. And that's what I love about it. And because of its use in these structures, often at the bottom, usually in doorways, such as in the natural gas building or the Quest building, which I have no idea what it's called anymore. It was a Ma Pell building, and Seattle's Exchange building, all this classic Art Deco. Darker entryway, they often use the Morton Gneiss, and I think they did it for a couple reasons. Art Deco, very much a architecture style of very defined shapes, ziggurats and angles and squares and triangles. And yet the Morton Gneiss has this incredible dynamic. So I think it was that contrast between the dynamic and the sort of static of Art Deco that you often see it used as both a complement and a contrast. And many Art Deco buildings have a lighter colored stone above the base. And so again, it was just this beautiful, beautiful material to be used. The Morton Gneiss has been quarried since the 1820s. But as I said, it's really gone out of style. The height of its popularity was in the 1930s and 1940s. But you still see a few buildings incorporate it, but it's just a beautiful, beautiful rock. And when I lead building stone tours in Seattle, which I used to do, and I know that you all do down there, I would always encourage people to reach out and touch this rock, because to me, it exemplifies one of the greatest ideals in geology, that idea of deep time. And I would tell people, when you touch that rock, you're reaching so far back into Earth's history. Earth really didn't even look anything like it did. The oldest evidence for fossil life on Earth, about 3.5 billion years. So we didn't even have the animals or plants that we think of as even now, or even hundreds of millions of years ago. So it's just that deep into time. And so for me, it's just this lovely and really amazing way to get people to connect and think about time and geology. And as I said, tell people, this is the oldest rock you will probably ever see in your life. And certainly probably the oldest rock you'll ever be able to touch in your life. Just an amazing, amazing building material. So I want to jump forward in time. I want to go back one image. And fly from Morton. I want to cross the country and go to just outside of Boston. Excuse me. To the town of Quincy, just south of Boston, where there used to be a massive quarry industry. Now this quarry, the site we're looking at, has been filled in by the sediment of the Big Dig. But we're going to go north to the signature building of the Quincy granite, and that is the Bunker Hill Monument. And this is an image of the Bunker Hill Monument. Geology in buildings often becomes popular because of a signature building. And with the building of this monument, granite becomes the building material in the East Coast, particularly in Boston, but throughout New England for decades after that. And the building stone, the Quincy granite, was so unusual that it changed transportation in the United States. And this may sound strange, but I'll come back to that in 1 second. The quarry was a very massive set of quarries all over the town of Quincy. 450 million year old granite, classic formation, granite down subduction, but then slammed into New England much later. So it formed, they're not sure whether it formed in Africa or where exactly it originally formed, but eventually ends up docked along the East Coast. The quarry used for decades and decades, but then it falls out of favor. Quincy granite, they stop using it, and the quarries start to fill and flood with water. And people took advantage of that. They swam in it. Supposedly mob bodies were tossed in it. There's all sorts of issues with it. And eventually when the big dig happened in Boston, they decided to use that sediment, the material from the big dig, and fill in the quarry. So now it's just a big grassy knoll with a little bit of granite sticking up above the surface there. But it's a really lovely spot. But the choice of the Quincy granite was made by an architect, Solomon Willard. Willard was the designer of the Bunker Hill Monument. And he decided to find the perfect granite for it. And the story goes as he walked something like 300 miles around New England to search it, and ends up finding it just outside of Boston. So downtown Boston is right here. We are in Quincy. It was about 2 miles from this river here, the Dorchester River. There was just one problem. How do you transport granite, heavy blocks of granite, from the quarry site to an area with water? And Willard and another man named Gridley Bryant come up with an idea of building the first commercial railroad in the United States to transport the stone from the quarry site down the railway, down here, down along to the Neponset River, and then they would float it up the Neponset River into Boston Harbor. And the quarry, the first initial rail was not steam powered, it was horse powered. And they had these little carts right here that ran along, and they could put the stone on it, pull it down. It's about 2 miles, almost all downhill. It was all downhill from the quarry site to the river, offload it, and then put the quarry stone onto a barge and float it up to Bunker Hill, and then carry it up the hill to Bunker Hill. And now all that's left, this is the only part of the rail line that is left at that area. But this was the first railroad, commercial railroad in the United States. And with the building of the Bunker Hill Monument, as I said, granite becomes the building material. Throughout New England, it was the premier stone to use, and you find it just in all sorts of buildings. And it's a pretty amazing building, amazing stone to use in this area. So you'll see it everywhere. That initial building I showed, the church built in 1754, also came from Quincy. But there, what's interesting is they quarried the blocks. They took boulders and dug out underneath the boulders, lit fires under them, heated the boulders, and cracked them by dropping an iron ball or beetle on them, and then would hit them into shape. But eventually there was a change in technology that I'll come back to in just a minute on how they cut the stone, and it starts again in Quincy. So this was really the center of sort of the stone building trade for the United States. So from Quincy, we're going to head back across the country to Indiana. We're going to head to the little town of Bedford, Indiana, just a little bit outside of Bedford, and we're going to head north to Bedford to the Salem quarries. The Salem limestone, also known as the Indiana limestone, the Bedford limestone, the oolitic limestone, is the most commonly used building stone in the United States. At one point, just almost every building you would see, large, beautiful edifice, particularly on the East Coast, was built out of Salem limestone. And what you're seeing here are hundreds and hundreds of blocks of limestone that have been quarried. Each of these probably 6 to 10 feet wide, 10 feet long, 6 to 10 feet high, just everywhere, just an incredible, incredible material. And if you go to the quarry site, what you would see, if you know the right place to go, is this hole in the ground. This is known as the Empire Quarry. This is where the most famous building made out of Indiana limestone or Salem limestone came. That, of course, is the Empire State Building. And this building, the entire building is clad. That quarry has never been used for anything else except for this building. The building of the, so I'll go back to this question. The railroad was 1824. Sorry if I didn't say that. And I don't actually have a close-up of Mr. Adams of Quincy, but they are from this area is where John Quincy Adams is from. So it's that area. It's a very gray, classic granite, sort of salt and pepper, but fairly dark granite that's found down there. Alkali feldspar, very dark quartz, for those of you who want the technical details on it. But the Salem limestone is the most famous stone. And I'm just going to interrupt because I have to say, if you're into Salem limestone and you're into biking and you're into geology, I got to recommend Breaking Away. If you've never seen this movie, it's a fabulous movie. All of it is filmed around Bloomington and Bedford, Indiana, which are right close to each other. You can see the quarries, you can see the stone, you can see the cutters there. Just an astounding movie. So I highly recommend it. Just that's my one movie, my interruption to talk about movies. Well, let's go back to the quarry. Let's go, this is a modern shot of one of the big quarry sites around Salem. And I want to talk about how do you actually quarry stone? How do you pull it out? And what we see here is analogous, think of it as a big brownie tin. And you have to cut it in rows, and then you have to excavate out, pull out all the brownies or all the blocks. And what we have here are basically big chainsaws like this that can cut into the stone. They use cord that's impregnated with industrial grade diamonds to cut through the limestone. And it's pretty incredible to see just how quickly they can go through this material. And it works for any type of material. Obviously, if you've got diamonds on it, cuts through anything, but especially well for the limestone. Then once you cut down in, the limestone, that blade is maybe 2-3 inches wide, the saw. There's two ways to remove the blocks. One is the purely mechanical way, go in with machinery, stick something down there and sort of pull over the block onto rubble. The other way they do it, and it's pretty amazing to see, I was lucky enough to be able to watch it, is they drop industrial grade airbags. So you've got a crack about 2 or 3 inches wide, you drop the airbags down in, you then inflate those airbags and tip over the block. And you can do a block that's here, 5 or 6 feet wide, 10 feet tall, 30, 40 feet long with these airbags and just tip them over. Then you send in the big machinery and remove all the material. So pretty incredible the way they're able to take the blocks out of this quarry. And they're just doing it constantly. Still one of the most commonly used building stone, at least American building stone. As you can imagine, and probably well know, building stone now comes from all over the world, to say the least. Industrial grade diamonds used in blades, or saw blades. They're also used for cutting here. This is basically another sort of a type of saw cutting through the block. But that was not always the way. What happened was when they were working on some granite block in Boston on the new prison in Boston, they were trying to figure out a way to cut stone better. And the story goes is that one of the commissioners on the project was going through a little town and he saw this guy cutting stone in a way that he had never seen before. And he stops and talks to him. And the man's name was Tarbox. We don't know his first name. All we know his name was Tarbox. And he told the commissioner, this is how I do it. I drill a row of holes in the stone. I then drop in 3 pieces of metal, basically two L-shaped, and then a wedge. As you can see right here, you pound that wedge in and it splits the stone. It basically opens the stone up. And I'm sure you've seen that. You've seen these drill holes. They look like sort of like clam holes in the rock. I'm sure you've seen that on many buildings around. And that was the method for decades. In fact, it was probably the method for several hundred, if not several thousand years. We know that, for instance, the Egyptians used a method like this. They may have used a type of metal, but another way to do it is you use this, have this hole, and you put a piece of wood in it, and you would drip water onto that wood. And as the wood absorbed the water, it would help crack the stone. Or if you're in a very cold place, say up in Scandinavia, you drill these holes in a row, you cap them, you pour water in them, cap them, and when that water freezes, that helps separate the blocks, to crack the blocks. So this hammer plug and feather method has been used for, as I said, for several thousand years. They still use it in smaller places, but they use it different. It's all hydraulic, as you might imagine now, but it's still a great method, still produces this characteristic look of these whole row of holes in the rock. So you probably will see it. What made the Salem limestone so popular is two things. One, its location in Indiana with a very good network of railroads, and in a sort of central location, you could ship it very easily. The other aspect of it was that it cuts in any direction pretty evenly. There's no preferential grain in it. My favorite piece of Salem limestone is this tombstone in Bedford, Indiana. The story goes is that there was a young man named Baker who worked in the quarry industry, had gone home for lunch, was killed by lightning. And to honor him, his coworkers rebuilt his bench exactly as he left it. So you can see that he had used a little broom, he had a hammer, a couple chisels, another chisel up here, there's a ruler back here, here's his apron, here's another hammer he would have used for working this material. It's over 100 years old, still in amazing condition. And if you go around and look at the front, excuse me, what's even more incredible to me is this bench would originally have been made of wood. And when Baker, we're assuming it was him, he made it, he tightened one of the bolts a little too tightly and cracked the wood. And they reproduced the wood, and here's the wood, it warped apparently at some point in the past, reproduced it exactly as he left it, as he had left the original bench, and it's still in pretty good shape. The question is, how does this limestone weather in cities? It does pretty well. I mean, you see it, there's several buildings in Portland with it, Seattle has it. It does okay as a limestone, it's not great, but if you read the early advertisements for it, they describe it as basically self-cleaning, however you want to define that. Maybe it would erode a little bit, but it does pretty well. It's a pretty impressive limestone as it goes. And Barbara's comment, my brother insists that Breaking Away is a great movie. It is a great movie. It is an amazing movie. So you find the Indiana limestone used particularly in monumental buildings, city halls, state capitals, cathedrals, libraries, post offices. Every state in the country has at least one building made of Indiana limestone. And in bigger cities, multiple buildings. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about Portland at the very end of it, but just an amazing material. It is a classic limestone, 330 million year old limestone, formed when what we think of as the Midwest was basically a shallow sea, sort of like the Bahamas, located roughly at the equator. Lots of little invertebrates living in the water. They die, they settle, the wave action breaks them up. And so when you look at the Salem limestone, you see these crinoids, this sort of sea star on an arm. You see these bryozoans that look a bit like rice check cereal, corals, all sorts of different animals left behind. So basically the entire stone is made up of little fossils here. So here's a crinoid stem, a little horned coral. Here's a bryozoan. Here's part of a crinoid, the big calyx, the flowery part. So if you have it, and I'm sure I've not looked at the building stones in Portland, I'm sure if you go and you will find fossils in there. And again, when I lead tours in Seattle, it's always really fun. People who've walked by buildings for years and years have never noticed that it's just the entire stone is full of little fossils. It's a very wonderful, great introduction for people to start noticing and connecting to that geologic world that's around them. So we're going to now head to the other Portland, back across the country. Excuse me. We're going to head to just outside of New York City, go up the Connecticut River Valley, to the town of Portland, and then down to a quarry site located along the Connecticut River. Like many quarries that are abandoned, it is flooded, completely flooded. Now is a big sort of recreation area. But all of this was quarry. This is where all of the brownstones of the East Coast come from. Not all, but most of it. This is sort of during the height of that era when brownstone was shipped all up and down the East Coast, but New York, Boston, Philadelphia, at one point, something like 96% of the stone buildings in Brooklyn were made of brownstone, and 80% of the stone structures in New York and Manhattan. And it's also one of the oldest quarried stones in the US. Starting in 1650, they started quarrying in this area. And where you see it is in these classic brownstone buildings, these long row houses. And that's where the term comes from, is because it was a brownstone used in these buildings. And you see, if you go through Brooklyn, you still find streets like this, just row after row with the wonderful stoop, this very beautiful architecture, just stretching down the block. Just an incredibly, incredibly popular building material. And it becomes popular during the 1850s, 1860s, and it basically dominates for the last half of the 19th century. So popular was it that James Flood, who was a big silver magnate out of Nevada, built this home on top in San Francisco. It's now the Union Club, a social club. It was one of the few buildings to survive the fire after the 1906 earthquake. But he had taken the stone from Portland, shipped it all the way down south, around South America, and all the way back up to San Francisco. It was that important that he have a stone like that. And it was a stone that was used often by the very wealthy, but also by the very poor. Everybody lived in brownstones, particularly in the New York area, but also in Boston and Philadelphia and a few other places. It is an incredible rock. It's about 200 million years old. It formed just as Pangea was starting to break up, as that supercontinent, North America, South America, Europe, and Africa start to pull apart, and you have the incipient opening of the Atlantic Ocean. Parallel to the ocean opening, you had valleys that formed, and lots of rivers washing into the valleys, lots of sediment washing in with the rivers, and lots of dinosaurs in this area. This is a slab of Portland formation or brownstone that had been a sidewalk in town. And at some point, someone remembered that when the sidewalk had been laid, that there were these curious marks on the bottom. The reason people were interested was an unusual man, Edward Hitchcock, who was a minister, worked at one of the colleges. He didn't drink, he didn't eat meat, but he noted, not that that precludes you from doing interesting things, I just want to clarify that, but he notices his attention is drawn to these tracks, these three-toed tracks. He always thought that they were birds. He never thought that they were dinosaurs. And when he's starting to become interested in this, this is just after dinosaurs are quote unquote invented around the 1840s, 1850s. So they're just starting to get out. And obviously we now know he was correct. Birds and dinosaurs obviously are directly related. But there's a great story about Hitchcock that I just want to share with you. He was in Manhattan one day in Greenwich Village and walking along, and he sees these tracks used in one of the building stones. And he has some plaster cast. He was always formally dressed, not as nice as I am in my vest, but really nice looking. And he was pouring like some plaster to try and make a cast of the tracks. And he draws attention to him, and the police begin to try and arrest him for doing this. I guess it was illegal to do that. But fortunately, one of his students comes up, sees Mr. Hitchcock, sees the police, sees what's going on, and goes up and tells him, oh, he's no more deranged than such men usually are. So we all have a long history of people wondering what we're doing, collecting, looking for rocks in strange places. But the Portland Formation, the brownstone, I've heard that people have seen tracks in buildings, but I was never able to find any I'm sure there must be some out there. But again, this was the building stone. Curiously enough, it was replaced in popularity by the Salem Limestone, which comes in after the Chicago World's Fair and the White City there. And you had two choices, marble or limestone. Limestone's a lot cheaper, so it becomes the popular building material, beginning of the 1890s going into the early 1900s, and then stretching for several decades after that. So we're now going to abandon the US and we're going to go across the globe. And we're going to head to what is arguably the most famous rock anywhere. And that, of course, is the Carrara Marble. We are just up the coast from Pisa, the little town of Carrara right here, and we are heading down into the Marble Mountains. These are the incredibly extensive quarries outside of Carrara. It's as if you were looking from Portland and you looked up to Mount Hood, and instead of it being covered in snow and it was white, all of that white would be marble. It is that extensive. I mean, you can clearly see from this. This is an example of the quarry industry there. These are just all roads. The roads are so steep, trucks go back. They go drive up one direction, back up the next, switch back, drive forward, back, drive forward. There must be some crazy drivers there. I was there with a geologist when we were looking and taking this photo, and he said he remembered as a kid coming here when much of this had yet to be quarried. This is the oldest quarry area down here at the lower part, all of this new material. And curiously, it's not taken out for use for buildings much anymore. It's mostly ground up for the purity of its calcite that's in there, which is sort of sad. So this is the building stone. Just zooming in on the quarry, just an incredibly extensive quarry area, all heavy machinery now. The most famous Carrara Marble, of course, by Michelangelo. He went, collected material there, or chose material there at the site, not the David, but other sculptures of his. So it becomes the ethereal stone, the epitome, the most elegant stone on earth. And it becomes so popular that everybody wants to use it. Just a little bit of the geologic history. It's like the Salem Limestone, deposited initially in a shallow sea about 200 million years ago. And then there's a little continental collision, and the limestone gets piled material gets piled on top of that limestone. It's buried very deeply, and it gets metamorphosed. And if you go to Carrara, you can drive from the limestone into the marble. You can drive back and forth as you cross that boundary where metamorphism changed the limestone to a marble. But the building that my favorite Carrara Marble story has to do with this building. Standard Oil's headquarters, 1970 was when it was built. And it was designed, curiously enough, ironically enough, by Edward Durrell Stone. And Standard Oil wanted to have an edifice. They wanted to show that they are this big, great company. And what better way to show how great you are than to cover an 1,100-foot tall building in marble. The entire building, 44,000 panels of Carrara marble. It was an astounding accomplishment. It was also a major mistake. You'd think in a company that is basically driven by oil and by geologists that they might have figured something out, but what they didn't realize is that the Carrara marble had this tendency to fail, because calcite, as it goes through freeze temperature cycles, the main mineral in limestone, has a tendency to expand and contract differently along either the X, the Y, or the Z axis. And they noticed after about 7 or 8 years that the building blocks, which each weigh about 300 pounds, are starting to warp on the building, just slightly off the building. One eventually falls off, another one eventually falls off. Fortunately, no one was injured from that. The lawyers then get involved, and the lawyers go, we really need to look at this. And they go out and they investigate, and they find 2,000 panels of warp. They're all starting to pull. And this warping is a good 1/2, 3/4 of an inch off the building. And they go, okay, we need to replace all 44,000 panels of the building. So over a couple year process, they take every panel off and they replace it with granite. The cost of replacing the panels was, I think, if I remember correctly, was about, if not more than the cost of the entire building in the first place. They have all this, they have 44,000 panels of marble. What do you do with it? Well, what do you think they did with it? They crushed it up into little tiny bits and used it for landscaping at one of the Standard Oil facilities. Curiously, a little bit of it though was saved. They made trinkets out of it. You can buy, I've looked and haven't found, but I know they're out there. There are bookends and little clock stands made of Carrara marble from the Standard Oil building. But they also took some of it and lined a pond at one of a college campus outside Chicago, and all the fish died in the pond, sadly. They went in and investigated. Turned out it wasn't the marble, but it was used for that. And I actually have a piece of that. It's probably one of my favorite pieces of geology I have. I have a piece of the Standard Oil marble. But so this marble was the building material, and it's why you see it in so many places. It's such a beautiful, beautiful rock. So let's head to the youngest of the building stones. We're going to head a little bit south from Carrara. We're going to head to just outside of Rome, to the little town of Tivoli. And here's Tivoli, about 30 miles to the east of Rome. And we're going to head over to its quarry area. All of this is quarry. This is an amazingly huge area of blocks being quarried, still being quarried here. And the most famous building made of travertine is right in Rome, and that is the Colosseum. The quarries in Tivoli have been used pretty much continuously for more than 2,000 years, and which is pretty impressive. And if you know much about travertine, you know that it is a type of limestone, as opposed to the Salem limestone that forms deep in the sea. The travertine forms in hot springs, and it accumulates very quickly. A normal limestone may take thousands of years to accumulate an inch. The travertine can accumulate maybe an inch, half inch of rock in just a matter of a couple of years. Just an incredibly rapid formation, layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And you can see these layers in this shot of the Colosseum. And what you can further see is the brilliance of the Romans. You all probably are well aware that Seattle used to have a little stadium called the Kingdome, which lasted, what, 20, 25 years before we blew it up and found something better. 2,000 years later, this building, the Coliseum, still in pretty good shape. And if you look at it, look at the building blocks at the bottom of the arch where all that pressure is, all that stress is. The blocks have their bedding planes horizontal to stress. And as they go up, the blocks are always kept that way until you get to the keystone, and you can particularly see it on this one. The blocks now have their bedding planes vertical, where that greatest amount of stress is. So the Romans understood the process of what the qualities of the stones were and what they needed in order to make good buildings. The holes in this are where there used to be pieces of metal, and people excavated out the metal from the building. Sadly, the Colosseum was often used as a quarry, particularly in the 1500s. Cardinal Farnese got to go in for 12 hours with 4,000 of his best friends and collect and take blocks of travertine out of the Colosseum. And you find buildings around Rome that the quarry was not Tivoli, the quarry was the Colosseum. And because it's made of calcite and has lots of little holes in it, I'll show you a close-up of travertine in a minute. It is a very good medium for growing. And you can see in this image, this Canaletto image. You can see all the shrubs growing on it. There were often trees just growing right out of the Colosseum until they cleaned it up. And just give you an idea, more than 300, 400 species of plant counted, and most recently about 240 species of plant counted growing on the walls of the Colosseum. So pretty amazing from that point of view. It is used widely through Rome. You see it in water fountains. Bernini used it in this lovely elephant, this bridge built across the Tiber River, the Ponte Fabricio, built in 62 BCE, still in good shape. And then one of my favorite buildings, and another one that again illustrates the brilliance of the Romans, is the Theater of Marcellus. And you can see that there are two types of building stone here. There's the Travertine up here. The Travertine is only used at the arches where you need that, resist that pressure, and at the keystones. The brown is volcanic tuff. This is a material that doesn't handle compression very well, but is pretty fire resistant. And Rome regularly burned, and the Travertine doesn't do well in fire, and the tuff doesn't do well if it gets really a lot of water on it. So if you combine the two, you protect the tuff a little bit, and you have something that's more fire resistant, it has a tendency to be a more durable and building. And that's why you see the Romans use these different qualities. They knew what was going on. They knew how buildings worked. They knew how stone worked. And so you see that throughout. In the US, you see Travertine widely used, but I would argue that the most amazing building with it is the new Getty Museum in Los Angeles, now no longer new. It's been there for quite a while now. And if you go to the Getty, you'll notice something curious about the blocks. They're different. This is a typical block of Travertine, layered like this. You cut it perpendicular to bedding, and then the block, you will see the bedding planes in the block, just as we saw in the Colosseum. That's the standard way. But Richard Meyer, who was the architect for the Getty, he and his associates came up with a new way of using it. What they did was they cut the Travertine into blocks about 30 by 30. They then, maybe 10 feet long, 30 inches by 30 inches, 10 feet long, tilted them on the side, and then fed that block through a guillotine. The guillotine would come down, hit the block, and open it along the bedding plane. And that's what they used as the surface of for the bedding, the blocks there. So all the blocks in Rome have this beautiful textured surface. And more fun, more intriguingly, is that those blocks are filled with fossils. Think of a hot spring or a pond in the fall with an environment rich with leaves. They fall in, they settle. And if you have a stone that forms very quickly, you can get incredible preservation. You can see insect damage. You can tell if the leaf is right side up. You can tell if it's upside down. There are literally thousands upon thousands of leaf fossils in the Getty Museum. And if you've been to the Getty, you realize there's really no reason to go inside the Getty. By far the most beautiful, the most interesting part of the Getty are the walls of the Getty. And if you go there, next time you go, when we're able to go again, there's a tram that takes you up to the main sort of entryway. And if you go to that entryway, the big sort of plaza, and walk straight out, there's a wall. You can sort of walk behind the wall there. And behind the wall, there's a panel. It's a double wide panel. And basically it's a fossilized swamp. You can see reeds, you can see algal mats. It's just probably the most impressive building stone panel anywhere. So this gives you just sort of an idea of some of the building stone that's used. I want to just look at Portland for a quick minute here and bring it back to that. There are a few Morton Gneiss buildings. Travertine is certainly used in Portland, the Portland Art Museum. Salem Limestone, the US Post Office. There's something like 750 post offices made out of the Indiana or the Salem limestone. Courthouse, again, a classic building to use limestone. You see them all over the country. And then there's this wall here, or what was here, that's what had been St. Mary's Academy. And Paul knows, and Denny knows, I got a little bit wacky about doing some research on this. And I just wanted to share the stories of this. If you're familiar with the great publications by Ralph Mason on building stone, he tells a story about this wall that used to be here. And he wrote, in the 1860s, sailing vessels arriving from Europe discharged their ballast at the foot of Clay Street before taking on a shipment of grain. Parishioners at the local Catholic church hauled the basalt pieces in wheelbarrows up to St. Mary's Academy and built the wall that still stands intact today. This was in 1985. The wall is no longer there. Basalt is no stranger to the downtown area, and it is odd that rock from Belgium was used instead of the same kind of material from the cliff below Broadway Drive, which is several thousand miles closer in a downhill haul to the Academy. It's a great story, but it really is an urban myth. The wall right now is a pretty pedestrian sort of, it's interesting, but it's not a classic old marble wall. But when I wrote to the St. Mary's Academy and talked to their archivist, and she wrote back and said, it is an urban myth. Let me read to you one account from their chronicles from November 15th, 1865. Our stone wall is completed, and we do not hesitate to say that no block in the city of Portland has been more expensive than ours. For the sum of $3,000 has been paid out of our treasury for grading, material, labor, etc. during the last 6 months. Would that our building be as solid as our wall, which will endure for ages. Love that quote, but obviously it didn't endure. And these Belgian blocks, as they're called Belgian blocks because that was the style of building block. It's just like French toast, Belgian block. It's the style, it's not where it's made. It's not where it was quarried. This is locally quarried material, probably most likely from just across the river in Washington. And then I want to end on the sort of Portland stone by I love this church. I just think it is such a beautiful building. Basalt is, we don't have basalt buildings in the Seattle area because we don't have any basalt around us. You don't see it. And I just love to see this building with this beautiful basalt. And then the Tenino sandstone, which is quarried from just south of Olympia, a 50-million-year-old limestone. But to me, this really exemplifies the beauty of the use of basalt and the beauty of the Portland architecture and its use of stone. I want to end with just a couple of thoughts about building stone. The first is that we are often told that nature is out there somewhere, that nature is, you have to go far to see it. But I would argue that we can find nature all around us if we take the time to stop, to look, to ask questions, and to explore the landscape that's around us. And we see that in buildings, this incredible geologic stories. Another aspect of it is that there's a lot of bad architecture out there, but if you focus on the building stone, you can overlook that and see the cool geology. And third is people use stone for a reason. They choose their materials carefully. Why did Standard Oil use marble? They wanted to make a statement. We could afford the very best rock in the world. We could afford the stone of Michelangelo, the Taj Mahal. Go to a bank. Banks are often made of granite. The idea being is that the building is as strong as, the institution's as strong as the stone of the building. So people use this material for a reason. There are stories in stone. And to me, it's a great way to connect people to geology, to introduce people to geology, to allow them to reach out and touch it and make those connections with place. And that to me is ultimately what building stone and the stories I try to tell are about, is connecting people to place, getting them to slow down, to be more observant, to ask questions, to develop a relationship with the world around them. Thank you. It's been my pleasure to talk to you. I will just make my one little announcement, then I'll do a stop share screen. If you're interested, they're basically the same book. There's a hardbound edition and a paperback. If you want to buy them through me, great. That's what I want to say. And I would love to be able to answer your questions.
And David, I want to thank you in particular. We have a number of people here in the audience today who've contributed to the Portland Building Stone Tour over the years. Of course, we are indebted to the original Ralph Mason article that was written in the 1970s, and that the tour here goes back to the 1950s. Chris Morganti, who's one of our guides, is here. Matt Bernengo, who's done some research on the Rocky Butte basalt, and Eric Wheeler, who's helped us a lot with the architectural history and has a lot to say about the Belgian block, I know. But David, your book, Stories in Stone, the 2009 version, I think more than anything, opened my eyes and many for us just to the depth of the history. We appreciate that you talk about the you know, the craftsmen, and we work a little bit with Matt Goddard, who's a stonemason here in town, but appreciating that they're actual people who quarried this, and that whole progression historically has just been just really opened all of our eyes to the beauty of stone and the history there. So thank you. And I'd also recommend your other book, if you're on the Puget Sound Naturalist walking book. If you spend any time in Seattle, I wish we had someone like you here in Portland, because I love your sort of panoptic view. And so thank you.
Thank you.
I think we
Let me
have
see
some
if I can
questions.
find questions. So I see one. Many of the Portland streets were paved with the ship ballast and still is under the current blacktop. I've seen that. Yeah, that's true, that there is some of it was used with ship ballast, and then some of it was also just was the block quarry called Belgian block. I know in there. Yes, Houston does have a guidebook to local building stones. Those are always fun. There's a great one for Vancouver. A bunch of cities are starting to do this. I would love to see someone, I'm not sure, put together. I think it'd be great to have a guidebook of tours of building stone from around the US. There's so many interesting stories to tell. Yeah, Morton Gneiss in Primeville. Oh, that's fun. Morton Gneiss is an amazing rock. And it's, as I said, it's been quarried for so long now. And it's a great story too. The other part of the story that I like about Morton Gneiss is that the reason we see it at the surface is because in Minnesota had some ice age floods, nothing like the good ones out here, real ice age floods. They have these little ones like 1 million CFS, nothing like we had, but that eroded out the Minnesota River Valley and exposed the Morton Gneiss. So the story of the Morton Gneiss stretches from the ice age all the way back 3.5 billion years in history. I just think that's such an amazing, amazing story.
One of the things I saw in your earlier picture of the gneiss in the quarry was what looked was a black chunk that looked almost like a xenolith, and I don't. And
it's
I
a
assume
piece. I think it's been a while since I looked at it. I know it's a very basaltic piece, and I think I can't remember what time period in the geologic story that represents. I just don't remember. It's been so long since I've been studying that.
I'm trying to remember your book that there's an initial pulse of plutonic rock 3.6 billion years ago, and then there's an injection of tonalite or something 2.4 billion years.
Yeah, it's a very complicated rock, and for a while they thought it was the oldest rock on Earth.
Uh-huh.
But they now know better. Any other? Let's see if there are questions. I miss them. Wondering why the Carrara Marble on Portland's Wells Fargo Tower hasn't warped. I would guess is that, well, you don't have the freeze thaw cycles like Chicago does. I think that's what really gets it, is that freeze thaw cycle on the stone. In Finland, there's a building in Helsinki designed by Alvar Aalto, Finlandia Hall, I think it's called, but I could be wrong. And covered in Carrara marble, and when it started to warp, that building started to warp, the blocks started to warp like this. So they replaced them with new marble, Carrara marble. They then started to warp like that in the opposite direction, replaced them a third time, and I think they finally got it right and put granite on. And so the warping of Carrara marbles building blocks occurs all over the world. It's not an uncommon thing. And it partially has to do with, sometimes they put it's the confining pressure on the block. It doesn't have a chance to expand. If it's held in there too tightly is one of the problems too, is how you attach it to the building. More, and the Oregonian, I don't think the Oregonian is not Morton Gneiss. It's another Minnesota gneiss that I think is only 1.8 billion. It's a practically brand new rock. Do you know that build? I was looking at the Oregonian. I'm pretty sure if it's.
Yeah, we confirmed we confirmed with Cold Springs Granite Company that's the Ortonville gneiss.
Okay.
And like you say, it's 1.8 billion years old, and
there it is. Okay.
They market it under the trade name agate.
So I'm curious about how I do research the history of building stone. Yeah, that was a fun part. The curious I did, part of it is there's a few other people like me who've been doing this, And so I, find their sources once you sort of start to recognize the stones. The challenge is to take the stone, and I'm purposely using the word stone, and take a trade name and convert it to a geologic unit. So for instance, as I said, the Morton Gneiss is known in the trade as the rainbow granite, and it's obviously not a granite. But I had to figure out what it was. And once I was able to figure out what the trade name was in a geologic name, I could then go back to the geology and figure out from there. And architects are mostly useless to help. I ask of some architects in regard to one of the building stones in Seattle. It's a French limestone, Comblanchon, which I think is in your guide.
Mhm.
And the person told me, I had a variety of people tell me, oh, well, we had it specially made for us. Wow, that's great, My favorite though is it was as old as the hills, which technically is correct. It is as old as certain hills, but they have no idea. And the names changed. I've heard the story of a marble quarried in Australia, and a lot of the stone, I'm not sure if it's still that way, but certainly 15 years ago, a lot of stone that was quarried around the world would be shipped to Italy because the cutters there were the best. And when it shipped from Australia, it was Australia marble. It was shipped to Carrara. It then all of a sudden became Carrara Marble because that was the source of it. And so you can't always trust many names out there. And I'm sure if you've been to a kitchen store and they're selling the granite countertops, we know about a third or 10th of the rock is actually granite. It's everything else in the world but granite.
I wanted to ask a little bit about local stone. Most of the folks here know the story of our Columbia River basalts and our local boring basalts. We don't have any significant sandstones that are quarried in Oregon. They all come from you up in Washington. Do you know what's the sort of the geological story of some, like you mentioned, the Tenino sandstone?
Yeah, so the three main quarry sites in the Puget Lowland were Tenino, Wilkeson near Rainier, and then Chuckanut near Bellingham. All are the same sandstones, about 50 million years old, when neither the Olympics or the Cascades existed. And what we think of as the I-5 corridor was basically oceanfront property. Streams or rivers washing out of Idaho deposited sediment into this river, into the oceanfront, so basically a big delta, and that's what they are, is they're all more or less related. They're about a 50-million-year-old sandstone.
So what were they eroding off of?
They're eroding off some sort of mountains further to the east in Idaho,
Okay.
as I understand it, and then just the rivers were flowing across what would have been basically a flat Washington.
But not Cascaden Mountains, but something else, or
Something else.
something
Yeah.
else. Okay.
They predate Cascades.
Mhm.
Told by London tour guide that interspersing each 14 inches or so of stonework with a single layer of brick was a Roman practice that helped walls withstand earthquakes, which were common in Italy, but not necessarily. I've not heard that, but that the Romans got it. I mean, they understood it. Next time you go to London, there's an app you can now download. I can't think of the name of it, that basically you can go to any building practically in London and look at it. And if you know the address, it will tell you the building stone. It's an incredible app if you want to dork out. I was lucky enough to go there with one of the sort of premier building stone guides in London. We spent 3 or 4 hours dragging my wife around London, looking at building stone, just dorking out. It was great. So. Yeah, Newcastle Island was another, near Nanaimo on Vancouver was a source of sandstone. Also up in that area was a big source of coal for this part of the world.
We want to address Carrie's question.
Are you working on a similar look? I haven't. I've written a little bit about building stone in the Seattle area, but I haven't done much done much in sort of outside of this area. I've been mostly, for the last 5 years, I've been working on a book about Puget Sound, about the human and natural history of Puget Sound is really what I've been focused on of late. If I'm understanding your question.
I can address that a little bit more because David, we'd love to collaborate with you in any form.
Yeah.
Carrie, we've had a downtown tour for the past decade, and we've had various guides and so forth. Eric Wheeler, who's on the Zoom here, our architectural historian, and Matt Goddard, our stonemason friend, and I have been thinking about how to memorialize that best. One thing that we've learned, especially in the era of COVID, is that the opportunities for collaboration and broadening the conversation beyond just, having a repository of expert information is really sort of where the frontiers are as far as getting this information out to the public. So we're working on some videos for that, but I am open to ideas about how to sort of create new media, whether it's a book or video, or when we get back to it, we'll be doing those walking tours once again. And David, I hope you can come down because we would love to have your eyes on the buildings that we walk
That'd be
by.
fun.
Yeah. And
So
hopefully
there's a question from Wesley about limestone in Indiana, and I didn't see it. How deep in the earth is a limestone deposit in Indiana? Right on the surface. They didn't have to go down. That was one of the advantages of the Indiana limestone, is it's a superficial rock. It's just everywhere. The hills around Bloomington, Bedford, Salem, which is where the name comes from. It's just right there on the surface, and it's just everywhere. There's a very slight overburden on it. How deep do the deposits go? I think several hundred feet, but it's been a while since I looked at it. Patty, on your question about the book is specifically about Puget Sound, and I have nothing. And the Salish Sea is a great name and it is an important name and a contribution. But I really focus on the stories from Admiralty Inlet down into about Olympia. I mean, though the stories I tell cross out of the Sound into the Salish Sea and sometimes cross into Canada, but I really focus on the Sound itself was my goal with that book. So it'll be out in the spring of 2021. Yay.
Well, that's
What are
probably
the properties of a good building stone? I think twofold. One is close to good transportation is critically important. So we certainly see that in the Seattle building stones, because the ones that were used, the Chuckanut, the quarry is right on the waterfront there. You just put it on a barge and float it down to Seattle. The index granite, which becomes very important in Seattle, and the sandstones are all along railroads. So that's a key property. The other is durability, the resistance to weathering. And also it helps if they can cut well. I mean, that was the key thing about the limestone, is that ability to be cut in any direction. There's no preferential direction on it. If you look at the brownstones, one of the reasons that the brownstone as a building material faded and it went away is how they used the blocks. They were all classic sandstone, layer upon layer upon layer. But if you look at a brownstone building, they are basically a curtain on there. So there'll be some sort of infrastructure underneath. The sandstone is just sort of a curtain on there. And if you put the block and if you cut the block so that it's perpendicular to the bedding, it does pretty well. But they started cutting the blocks and taking them and tilting them like this. So if the building was like this, instead of the bedding being like this, the bedding was like this. And in an environment like particularly the East Coast, where you have these great freeze-thaw cycles and you use a lot of salt on your roads, salt and water gets into the layers and they start to break. And the buildings and the brownstones basically sort of got a sunburn and just peeled off layer after layer. Now, if it was probably one of our houses, we think, hey, that's pretty cool. You get to see erosion on your house, but didn't really do so well in the East Coast. And they eventually, basically most of the buildings are gone. The brownstones that are left, what they do is they sandblast off the weak sandstone, the weak layers, and then put stucco over it. So it's really sort of boring. Idaho batholith. Thank you, Matt, for that. Hardened after it's carved. That's a stone hardening after it's carved is not an uncommon thing. And one of the best for that was a stone used in Florida. The coquina in St. Augustine, Florida. After that stone if you've ever seen coquina, imagine it's incipient limestone. It's limestone just in the process of forming. It looks, you can still see all the shells. It looks like what would happen if you sort of took wet glue into a pile, or weak glue into a pile of shells, and then cut that into blocks. But with that, after it's pulled out of the ground, it has a tendency to sort of harden on the surface a little bit and become a little bit better material. It's not a great building material unless you're building a fort and the British are attacking you. But that's not too common anymore. Cool. Well, I want to thank all of you for sitting through all this. It looks like most people stayed, and it's been my pleasure to share these stories with you. I do hope someday to get down to Portland and be fun to go out in the field with you all to see your buildings, to learn from you, to share my stories. And again, I wish everyone a safe and healthy holiday season. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure.
Thank you, David. It was a great talk.
Thank you, Sheila.